1000. New York, New York, 83 million, inhabitants 32,000, streets 5. Burrs 3 rivers which altogether make up one city unlike any other on the planet. What's all the more remarkable is that when you, 1000, stop to consider what makes the city so recognizable today, whether it be the iconic skyline, famous cultural offerings, or the energy of its streets, you realize that virtually everything that makes New 1000 York so renowned the world over simply did not exist even as little as a century ago. That is, because much of the city's history has been shaped by constant evolution, development, and 1000 renewal, which has transformed New York unimaginably over the years. But how did this city, which started off as a small outpost for European traders just over 400 years ago, evolve into the sprawling 1000 megametropole that it is today? This is how New York became the world's greatest city long before the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers of modern day. New York, the area, was full of dense 1000 forests, flowing rivers, and abundant wildlife. The land itself was home to groups of Algonquin-speaking Native American tribes, chief amongst which were the Larry people, who lived in harmony 1000 with nature, hunting, fishing, and cultivating the land in an undisturbed manner for some 8,000 years until the arrival of the first Europeans. The European exploration and 1000 colonization of the Americas began in earnest at the outset of the 16th century as navigators from nations like Spain, France, and the Netherlands sought out new trade routes to these newly 1000 discovered and resourced our territories. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the flag of France, became the first European to set eyes on the shores of what would one day become 1000 New York Harbor. Verrazzano claimed the area in the name of France, although any attempt to follow this up with colonial settlement failed to materialize. It would be almost another 100 years before 1000 Europeans would return to the area, and it would be the Dutch who would ultimately leave the first lasting impression on what would eventually become New York City. In 1609, the English explorer Henry Hudson, who was in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, had been tasked with finding the elusive Northwest Passage purported to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Whilst on 1000 this expedition, Hudson sailed up the northern river of New York Harbor, which now bears his name in honor of his discovery. He claimed the land on either side on behalf of the Dutch Republic, and 1000 in the process established a foothold for future Dutch settlement and trade in the region. The following decades saw Dutch trading posts established along the banks of the Hudson River, as well as 1000 others dotted along the coastline, stretching from the Delaware River to Cape Cod, which formed the wider territorial claims of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Initially, these 1000 isolated dwellings and their occupants were focused entirely on the commerce produced by the fur trade, but in 1624, the Dutch West India Company decided to send a ship full of colonists to 1000 established permanent civilian settlements in the region. They first landed on what is now Governor's Island, but were then dispersed amongst the chosen sites for settlement across New 1000 Netherland. A small group were disembarked on the southern tip of Manhattan after it was decided to construct a fortification there to protect the entrance to the Hudson River 1000 and the valuable cargoes of the fur trade which passed upon on it. With that, the foundations of Fort Amsterdam were laid out in 1625, and it quickly formed the epicenter of a new settlement which 1000 sprung up around it. New Amsterdam was born, and so too were the beginnings of New York City. Just to quickly pause for a moment and let you know that making these videos involves a lot of work on our 1000 side, from researching script writing and animation to editing and final composition. Although this is very much a passion project and something we truly love doing, it can, like any kind of work or 1000 aspect of modern life, take its toll on our mental health. There have been times when the pressure of meeting deadlines, the stress of ensuring the quality of our content, and the constant need to be 1000 creative have left us feeling overwhelmed and mentally drained. It's during these moments that we realized the importance of prioritizing our mental well-being and seeking support when needed. 1000 just like how we put in hours of effort to create the best possible content for our viewers, it's equally important to invest time and energy in taking care of our mental health, whether it's taking 1000 breaks when needed, practicing self-care, or reaching out for professional help. We've learned that addressing our mental health is crucial for both our personal and professional lives. That's where 1000 BetterHelp, today's paid partner, comes in. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that makes starting therapy easier and much less intimidating. With BetterHelp, you can have therapy sessions as a phone, 1000 call, video chat, or even messaging. Whatever is the most comfortable version of therapy for you, they can match you with one of over 1,000 credentialed therapists in their network based on 1000 your needs, preferences, and location, giving you access to a wider range of expertise that may be available in your city. If you feel like your therapist isn't a great fit, you can switch 1000 therapists with a click of a button in your settings at no additional cost. Join over 4 million people who've used BetterHelp to start living a healthier, happier life. Go to BetterHelp.com. This is 1000 history or select this is history at, sign up for a special discount of your first month of therapy in the following year of 1626 with the hope of legitimizing their claim to the new colony. The director, 1000, General of New Netherland Peter Mint, purchased the land of Manhattan from a small band of local Arp Indians in exchange for traded goods worth 60 guilders, roughly $1,000 in today's money. 1000. From here the colony began to grow, and under Minuit's successor Peter Stiers, its population reached some 1,500 people. By the year 1655, however, Stiers was widely disliked. 1000. By the settlers for the policies that he introduced. These included regulations on alcohol sales, attempts to assert control over the Dutch Reformed Church, and the blocking of other religious groups such 1000 as Quakers, Jews, and Lutherans from establishing places of worship in the colony. The Dutch West India Company attempted to intervene by introducing more lenient policies and reform, however. 1000. These plans were quickly interrupted by the outbreak of war in the latter half of the 17th century. The Netherlands was locked in a fierce rivalry with England to become 1000. The uncontested maritime and commercial superpower of the age between 1652 and 1673, a series of 3 conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars saw Dutch and English fleets battle it out on the high 1000 seas for naval supremacy. It was against this backdrop in 1653 that the inhabitants of New Amsterdam decided to construct a defensive wall along the northern boundary of the settlement. 1000. Modern-day Wall Street to protect against potential attacks by English forces coming overland from Newland Eng land to the north. Nevertheless, despite their best efforts to deter any would-be attacker in 1664, the English sent a small fleet to wrest the entire colony of New Netherland and its capital of New Amsterdam from Dutch control. Stiers was unable to cool on any resistance and consequently 1000 surrendered the city without a fight. The English renamed Fort Amsterdam as Fort James and the wider colony of New Netherland, as well as the actual of New Amsterdam itself, as New York in honor of 1000 James the Duke of York, who would later become the future King James I. New York briefly fell under Dutch control again in 1673, but was quickly returned to the English under the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, which ended the series of hostilities between the two nations. Under English rule, New York continued to grow and prosper, fueled by a thriving economy and a steady influx of 1000 immigrants arriving from Europe. The city, however, retained many of its citizens, institutions, and practices that were introduced by the Dutch, including the institution of slavery, which had become 1000 embedded in New York's economy through the shipment of slaves through the port, so much so that by the 1740s some 20% of the residents of New York were slaves, totaling about 500,000 people. As the 18th century progressed, New York emerged as a center of political and cultural change. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the city served as a hub for 1000 the dissent organization called the Sons of Liberty, who targeted the sizable portion of New York's population who were fervent Royalists. Similarly, the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 was convened in New 1000 York to unite the American colonies in opposition to the Stamp Act introduced by the British government. This articulated the grievances and taxation rights of the 30 colonies, which 1000 ultimately laid the ideological framework for revolution and the subsequent declaration of independence. During the War of Independence, New York City continued to play a pivotal role whilst it was 1000 initially occupied by the forces of the Continental Army. When war broke out in 1775, the Battle of Long Island, which was fought in August of the following year, saw the American forces under General 1000 George Washington suffer a crushing defeat at the hands of the British. The subsequent occupation of New York by British forces would last for the duration of the war, with the city serving as a strategic base for their military operations across the country. By 1783, however, the war was ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and the British began to evacuate their 1000 forces from the city, bringing an end to nearly a decade of occupation, which resulted in New York emerging as a shining light of liberty in the new American nation. In January 1785, 1000 New York was chosen to be the new national capital and played host to some of the most important events in the nation's early history, with the first President George Washington being 1000 inaugurated at Federal Hall in April 1789, as well as the first Congress being formed and the Bill of Rights being drafted, all in the same building on present-day Wall Street. With the dawning of the 19th century, New York had emerged as a global center of finance and banking, with Wall Street and Lower Manhattan being home to the Bank of New York, which was founded by Alexander Hamilton back in 1784 as 1000, well as the New York Stock Exchange, which was set up in 1792. Similarly, as the early 1800s progressed, New York continued to prosper as a center of trade and commerce, with the construction of the I Canal, linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean, completed. In 1825, the canal transformed New York into the nation's premier port, overtaking the likes of Boston and 1000 Philadelphia in both importance and capacity. As the city continued to grow in size, New York underwent a dramatic transformation as waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia swelled its population from 60,000 in 1800 to well over 500,000 by the middle of the century newcomers fleeing poverty, persecution and political upheaval arrived in New York City in search of opportunity and a fresh start, thus the thousand, transforming the city into a vibrant, melting pot of cultures and ethnicities. The number of inhabitants within the city was also furthered by the abolition of slavery within the thousand state of New York in 1827, leading to an influx of freed African Americans. The Lower East Side in particular became a focal point of immigrant life with crowded tournaments, thousand, and bustling marketplaces teeming with new arrivals from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and China. However, with this dramatic increase in Asian came unintended consequences. The overcrowded living thousand conditions were hotbeds for diseases such as chera, which broke out multiple times beginning in the 1830s, and many of the packed tenement buildings were destroyed in the Great Fire of New York thousand in 1835, which leveled some 50 acres of the city. Other poor and overcrowded neighborhoods such as the Five Points and Hell's Kitchen also had their share of poverty-related problems, with thousand notorious criminal gangs such as the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys roaming the streets and resorting to petty theft, robbery and violence to make ends meet. The city's problems continued with thousand the outbreak of the American Civil War, which engulfed the country in 1861. Although New York State was firmly part of the Union, the city's strong commercial ties to the South, coupled thousand with its growing immigrant population and anger over conscription, led to divided sympathies. The New York Draft riot of 1863 broke out over the resentment towards wealthy men being thousand able to buy their way out of proscription, and the resulting 5-day riot marked one of the worst incidents of civil unrest in American history. Following the war, New York City entered thousand somewhat of a cultural boom. Central Park, which opened to the public back in 1858, provided a green oasis and recreational space for all New Yorkers to enjoy. Meanwhile, the theaters of Broadway and thousand the concert halls of Carnegie Hall played host to a dazzling array of performers and productions, cementing the city's reputation as the cultural capital of the nation. Similarly, New York saw the thousand founding of several museums and libraries during this time, with the American Museum of Natural History being founded in 1869, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opening in 1870, and the New York Public thousand Library being established in 1895. The increase in cultural offerings also saw journalism flourish, with newspapers like the New York Times, New York Herald, and New York World thousand playing major roles in shaping public opinion and the city itself becoming a national hub for the media industry. New York's continuing expansion further northward up the island of thousand Manhattan, as well as development of connections into the neighboring towns over on Long Island, spurred the development of infrastructure projects such as the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883. Then in 1886, perhaps New York's most iconic and defining landmark was gifted to the city by the nation of France. The Statue of Liberty was sited in the middle of New York Harbor, and thousand served as a beacon of hope to the millions of immigrants arriving on its shores before many of them were to pass through the immigration office established on Ellis Island in 1892, and thousand then on to new lives in America. The rapid scale of development within the city continued well into the following 20th century, with a new New York City subway opening in 1904, connecting City Hall to thousand Harlem and Brooklyn. The city's skyline also saw its share of development during this time, with the likes of the Williamsburg and the Manhattan Bridges opening in 1903 and 1909 respectively. Thousand these feats were only outdone in scale by the competitive efforts of architects and developers who wished to build the tallest and most extravagant buildings in the world, which resulted in the iconic silhouettes of skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, being topped off by the early 1930s, which proudly displayed the city's economic thousand and architectural confidence to the world. Meanwhile, below-ground speakeasy and jazz clubs flourished during the city's era of decadence in the 1920s, even though this coincided with thousand the years of Prohibition, when the federal government outlawed the sale of alcohol, bootleg liquor, and illicit entertainment flowed hand in hand, so much so that the city was estimated to have a thousand proliferation of anywhere between 30,000 to 100,000 illegal clubs alone. The party times of the Roaring Twenties, however, came to an abrupt end with the Wall Street crash thousand of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression of the 1930s. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared, leaving millions of New Yorkers finding themselves out of work and struggling to make ends meet. Thousand many of the city's parks, including Central Park, became home to thousands of desperate people who constructed shanty towns named Hoovervilles in an ironic jab toward the President Herbert Hoover. Thousand for allowing their misfortune to happen. The situation for the city only began to improve with the outbreak of World War II in 1939, although the United States would not enter the war for another 2 years. New York City found itself mobilizing for war as factories churned out tanks, planes, and ships for the Allied, because while the city's ports and docks became vital lifelines for the thousand transportation of goods across the Atlantic. When the US did finally join the conflict in 1941, many of its troops, sailors, and airmen found themselves embarking on huge ocean liners out of New York's thousand. Stocks that carried them on their journey to the front lines. The post-war years saw New York transform into the city that it is today, while many of the world's other great thousand cities lay in ruins. New York emerged with new global prominence. It became the home of the United Nations headquarters in 1952 and inherited Paris's role as the center of the global art world, as well as becoming a rival to London's financial markets by the 1960s. Although during the 1970s the city became notorious for its levels of crime and deprivation, efforts to modernize and rejuvenate saw many of the older pre-war buildings redeveloped or torn downtown to make way for modern glass and steel constructions such as the World Trade Center, which was completed in 1973. Since then, like all cities, New York has continued to experience its fair share of trials and tribulations. What makes New York perhaps the greatest city in the world, however, is that no matter how many times it has been knocked down and set back, it has been able to pull itself back up and reinvent itself in such a way that perhaps many other cities of the world would struggle to achieve. Throughout its 400 history, the city has constantly evolved and developed time and time again, to the point now where it is completely unrecognizable from that small Dutch settlement that it started out as all those years ago.